Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Karen Springs. Welcome to the show, Karen. Looking forward to chatting and find out more about you. And what
Happy to be here.
So Karen moved to the Ukraine, and she opened her house up to people that were adoptive parents, so people that were going through this process. And you hosted like over 200 parents, didn't you, that were going through their process. And wow, what that must have been a hell of an adventure for you.
Yes, yeah, it was chaos and it was fun.
Yeah, and after she'd done that, and how long were you in? How long were you in Kyiv? I mean, it was Kyiv in the day, not Kyiv like it's now, right?
Kyiv, yes. So I lived there for about 14 and a half years.
Yeah, wow. And Karen came back to the US, and she interviewed 63 adoptive parents about their own adoption journeys, and then wrote a book. So as usual, listeners, check out the show notes for links to the to Karen's book and our website. And today we're going to be looking at one of the chapters in her book, because this is an area that I've had requests for. And the specific area that we're going to be looking at today is integrating a family with biological and adoptive children, because it presents its own complexities. Every adoption is different. Every adoption has different complexities, and we're going to kind of dive into we're going to dive into this theme. So why was that a chapter in the book, Karen?
Yeah, I think it was practically a chapter because the majority of families that I interviewed already had children when they adopted, and part of that was because the families that adopted from Ukraine, in Ukraine, it's primarily older children that are available for adoption, not infants. So it was primarily not couples, that had been struggling with infertility that were adopting from Ukraine. They were adopting because they felt a calling to help children in need, and those children were older children, and so the families tended to be a little bit older, had some parenting experience, and so they were open to adopting 1 to say 3 children, and then they already had, say, 1 to 3 children at home. And so I would venture to say about 90% of the families I interviewed had biological children when they adopted other kids.
So you've got, yeah, and obviously you've got the cultural complexity, and kids coming from Ukraine, adding another layer of complexity as well. And I would guess it's hard to disentangle that stuff, isn't it? Really, because in a scientific approach, you would be looking to look at these two complexities separately, right? Mm-hmm. But we're talking about human beings, and you can't disentangle the international angle from the mixed angle, the fact that you're integrating biological kids and adopted kids in one family.
Yeah, and I think language was a part of it, culture was a part of it. I think some families thought, well, as soon as our child learns to speak English, things will go. Right now we just have I think a lot of things, especially early on when they were in country, they would just chalk up as like, oh, well, this is just because we can't communicate very well in the same language. Like once our child learns English, right, a lot of these things like will just go away. So people would chalk things up as cultural. And cultural definitely played a part in it for sure, in the integration factor. But I think some things parents just thought would like go away in time. In reality, they don't.
They stuck. I mean, there's this. It's a common refrain, isn't it? Wherever, whatever sort of adoption that we're talking about, that there's in theory there's no difference between theory and practice. right? But in practice, there's huge difference between and that, and we've got these expectations. We've done the training as adoptive parents. We've done the training, and we're kind of underestimating it. Usually, we're underestimating how tricky it's going to be, and that sends us. I guess does that. Did you hear much about adoptive parents beating themselves up for underestimating this stuff, or were they more about questioning themselves? What was going on for them internally when this underestimation of the complexities came to reality, came into focus for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, well, especially with the adding, kids, adopted kids, to the children that they already had, you talked about scientific research, will show you not to disrupt the birth order. They'll, if you read any, adoption literature, it'll always say, add to the bottom of your children, right? Don't, if you have a 5-year-old, go lower than 5. If you have an 8-year-old, go lower than 8. And so that's what literature will tell you. But these families, had often met a child prior to the adoption, or they'd heard about a child that they were coming specifically to adopt that didn't follow the birth order thing, right? Because children in Ukraine are older. And so I think families, even though they'd read the literature and they're like, okay, we're not supposed to do this, or you're not supposed to twin children, right? Adopt a child the same age as the child you already have. But I think like their bleeding heart of compassion, and this feeling of often out of their faith, right? God had called them to adopt this child. So I think they just felt like, well, if we're called to adopt this child, then clearly that won't be an issue, right? It was like they kind of wanted to brush it aside of just saying, yeah, it's an issue for people, but it won't be an issue for us. I think so many families had this self-awareness to now say, like, we thought we were an exception to the rule, right? And then once we got home, suddenly we realized that like we weren't an exception to the rule, right? That this was still going to be really hard. And I think so that was a humbling moment, because there was maybe a sense of like pride and arrogance, like, oh, we've got this, right? Like we know how to adopt, we know how to parent children. And I found that families that had parented their children well, right? Like they had biological children that they could say, we're thriving, we're doing well. So they could like almost say like, oh, we're really good parents, right? We know how to parent well. So then they adopt a child that's older, and suddenly they're like, oh, right, maybe we're not these amazing parents that we thought we were, right? Because we're just parenting out of what we know. Like none of it had been, right, trauma informed or any of the things, that they had learned yet. And so it was like everything they'd known before, it was like they had to throw out the window and start over again. And so I found that families, when I interviewed them, were in a very like humbled position, right? Whereas like maybe they'd entered into the adoption with some pride and arrogance of like, we've got this, we know what we can do this. And I was seeing them at like, they'd gone through the deep waters and were now more reflective of like, oh, wow, right? There's a reason why the experts said not to adopt 2 children the same age as the 2 children we have, right? Because that brought in challenges that we didn't foresee. So
yeah. So what happened when if somebody's listening and they're at the point where they've been humbled, it's proving a lot tougher than they thought. The adoption is proving a lot tougher. What were some of the things that you heard from the adoptive parents that had underestimated it and then come through, been to rock bottom but made it through without the adoption or the kids being readopted? I heard you use that word, readopted. So what were some of the themes of their learnings, their behaviors, their actions? You know, what was the difference that made the difference?
I think a lot of that was one, giving their biological children space to express how they were feeling, but and both, I mean, biological children, adoptive children. Like, I think some parents felt like at the beginning that perhaps that they just needed to, like, everyone needed to just keep going, right? Like, let's not talk about how we're feeling, right? Let's just keep going. Because it was like, if they let the biological children start expressing their angst or their feelings, right, like that might negatively affect the children that they're trying to integrate into the home. But and it was almost like, maybe if we don't talk about it, right, that it just isn't here. I felt like some parents started with that mindset, but as time went on and they saw maybe some of their biological children starting to go inside and close up, they realized that they can't lose their children and they need to tap into what they're feeling. And so I remember there were several families that said they just made it a point to have one-on-ones with each of their children. So with the and sometimes, you know, it was very clear that the child was struggling. Other times it was almost doing the proactive thing of the checking in, right? So taking, you know, say you have a 10-year-old daughter, out and taking her out, you know, for a coffee or a lunch or something, and just giving her space to express what she's feeling. Like, how are you doing since we brought your brother home? And sometimes I think that the children didn't feel like they had the freedom to express how they were feeling until the parents like let them know. And so I remember there was one mom, she talked about how, you know, she had her two biological sons in the car and she really hadn't ever checked in with them on how they were doing, you know, since bringing home a sister who had been very disruptive to the family, just in terms of her behavior. And she said it was this one car ride. And she just kind of even opened up to her sons of saying, like, this has been really hard, hasn't it? Like, our family's not the same. And so she just kind of like opened up with her own struggles and saying, like, you know, this is hard for mom too. And this is how it's hard. And she said it was like the boys finally felt the freedom to just like express what they were feeling, and that they were able to say, like, yeah, things aren't the same. This is so hard. She does this, she does that. And so it was like the mom allowed them to just process everything they were feeling, and then kind of talk through strategy of like, okay, how do we keep going? Like, we're not giving up on the sister, but it's okay for you to come and tell me, right, when things are hard. Like, you don't have to shut up inside of you what you're feeling. And I felt like for a lot of families, they said once they gave their kids permission to express their angst or their anger or their sadness, you know, a lot of it was sadness because they were grieving the loss of the family that they'd had before. And I think that was something that a lot of families weren't prepared for, is that like you had this tight nuclear family and then you bring in a child that disrupts that, and there's a grieving process of like, you're no longer the family that you were before. And I think they weren't prepared to go through those comparisons. You know, there was one mom that said she would secretly want to like put the adoptive children to bed like before the biological children, just so that they could have like a family movie night like they did before. And she's like, and I didn't know if that was, you know, is that right or wrong that I have this desire to like kind of recreate the nuclear family that we were before these other children came in. So there was a lot of emotions, right, that came in with that.
Yeah. Wow. It's this area fascinates me because me and my wife haven't got any kids, right? So, but I know that I've done a lot of work in elementary schools with kids, in groups of kids, and as a workshop leader, a speaker, not one-to-one kind of heavy therapy work or anything like that, but in group. But I've found when I've shared stuff about me being bullied, for example, right? They have felt, I've got the sense from them that me leading with how I felt gave them permission led them to trust me. I really got the feeling that adults didn't do that. The kids told me adults don't do that. Adults aren't. They don't share how life was like for them when they were the same age as the kids. That was the expression that I got. I also got I got the idea that this was a foundation of trust piece, for somebody to open up, and it wasn't the norm. And so this area kind of fascinates me in terms of the extent to which parents open up about their own stuff. And clearly you can't, this isn't something that we can reduce to a 10-point scale of sharing our own stuff. We have to do what feels right for us. But can you talk into a little bit more about that? I'm not sure where the question is, but I guess the question is, what did you learn about that? What did you learn about that stuff?
Well, I mean, I think that, yeah, I think it's that balance though too of, I think that parents really struggled with, of, like you said, how much do you share to normalize things for your kid? I mean, there was one mom I remember that was like, she found that she was giving her children like lots of space to process their angst, like this specifically their biological children. Every night she would kind of check in with them of like, how are you doing? And really letting them like share their emotions. And then she said it got to the point where like it was like every night was like a bash session on the sibling, right? And so she said, then after a while I realized I needed to stop checking in. Like I needed to maybe just let things, like maybe he doesn't need to tell me everything that he's feeling, and maybe if I check in not every night but like every week or every month, it won't be as like this intense, like tell me everything that you're feeling. And I think that's where families, like I saw parents kind of carrying that weight of, it's like, as a parent to a child, you don't want your kids to carry what you're feeling, right? And so I think it's that, like, you want that level of vulnerability to say like, yeah, mom or dad is like struggling as you are. But then like how much is too much to share? I think it's that like fine line of like parent child, of like, you want to be real and authentic with your kids, but you don't want your kids to carry, right, that weight. Because I saw I remember specifically an older kid. I mean, he had seen his parents go through hell with his adopted siblings. I mean, just really, really hard stuff. And he had gotten to the point where he was just so angry. He was just so angry because he saw just the sadness that his parents were carrying. And so you could tell that he just took on like this anger toward his older, and it was like a lot of time had gone by. It was a family who'd gone through a lot of different things, but he just saw the pain his parents had gone through, and he kind of took on the pain of his parents. So it's like, you can kind of see it's such a delicate balance of that, like checking in, being real and authentic, but then not allowing your kid to take on your emotion. So I think that, and I saw parents taking on their kids' emotions too, like when they would see their child getting bullied or hurt by their adoptive child, then suddenly they start taking on the emotions of their biological children. And it's like, well, how come I'm feeling all mama bear about one of my children, but not another one of my children? So it was that delicate balance of like taking on one another's emotions, was an interesting one to observe, and how parents did that well, or perhaps struggled in doing that well.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of what.
Kind of, yeah. I'm not sure the question to ask other than what you've learned. Let me try it a different way. I remember a couple of years ago, I was doing an online course, right? So there was Zoom calls as well as videos. It wasn't all recording, so you get a chance to ask the mentor, and it was a mixture of kind of self-awareness and business stuff, right? And what the guy said, he'd been a coach for like 30 years, what he said was, there's a lot, isn't there? Since the what's the book called? The Secret, like 20 years ago, people talk about manifesting. So this idea is, you can manifest what you want in the world, right? And I guess adoption might be one. You manifest an adopted child. And people say, well, if it's God's way, then this child will come to me. And anyway, but he was talking about it in terms of business. And there's this idea of, are you doing enough? And he said, well, if you think that you're doing enough, you're probably not. And and then it works the other way around as well. So if you think you're doing too much, you're probably not doing enough. It's like the gut is the opposite. The truth is probably the opposite of where you're at. So I'm thinking, so how would I apply that to that? So if you're thinking, am I sharing enough about how I feel? If I'm sharing too much, you're probably not sharing enough. And if you think that you're not sharing enough, you're probably sharing too much. And I don't know whether that makes any sense at all. I'm just trying to Jalouse, I guess, what or get the listeners to think about that, self-reflect on their own level of sharing, and ask you what you learn about that, about finding that line, about the extent to which parents underestimate or overestimate the need to communicate, because we can over communicate. When I'm 55 now, so when my mum asks me how I'm feeling and stuff, like, I'm thinking, tells me to be safe, or be you're going out for the night, or be safe. I just think it's just water off the back. Sometimes if we do too much, if parents do too much, it becomes like noise. I'm thinking of my friends getting the lads that I know who are married, getting just being criticized by their wives to a point that it's just water off a duck's back. And I'm just asking you, what's your take on this over or under communication? What have you learned from the past? That was a really long question, wasn't it? Sorry.
Yeah, and I think so much of it came down to, it's so fascinating because interviewing so many different parents, right? You see so many different personality styles. And I think that some people are just natural communicators and natural sharers, right? Like, I mean, their bent is to express how they feel, or their bent is to, right? And it's interesting because I would say a lot of adoptive parents, right, because they have something in them, right, that causes them to adopt a child, that's a unique personality already, right? That there's this heart that like has a heart of compassion, right? So, I mean, not every person adopts. So like I was, interviewing a swath of the public that has chosen to adopt. So I would say a lot of these mothers specifically were already like women that were more in touch with their emotions, right? Because they were willing to like walk out. So that was so interesting, because when I compare these families I interviewed who had adopted to like my normal set of friends that maybe haven't adopted, right? I would say that as a whole, that these would be families that are like more in touch with their emotions of compassion because they made that decision to adopt. So I would say in that realm, they probably are more communicators. But then you kind of pair that maybe with different like children, biological or adopted. So then you have some kids in the home that might be naturally more in touch with their emotions and willing to share, right? But then you have other kids that like they just don't express, like they're not as expressive. And so I think parents maybe struggled to get out of their kids, right? Maybe what they were feeling. So maybe like mom was fine expressing how she felt, but then was struggling to get a read on how her kids were feeling. And then you pair that with, you know, an adopted child who maybe has gone through some significant trauma and has a hard time expressing their feelings and their emotions. And I think that sometimes like created a bit of barrier too, where it's like you have parents that are willing to go there to talk emotion, and then perhaps an adopted kid that isn't. And then biological kids I found were kind of hit or miss. There were some that were like very in touch with how they felt and could express it. I interviewed some children as well. I interviewed some of the kids in the home who were biological children, and I interviewed some of the kids that were adopted children. And that was fascinating as well, just to hear those that were more expressive in what they had experienced, and kind of some of those expectations too, because I think a lot of kids maybe went into the adoption thinking like, oh, how fun, I'm getting a sibling. And so their expectations were like all unicorns and rainbows of like, I'm going to get a new best friend, a new playmate. And then suddenly that kid comes into the home with very different expectations. They're not looking for a new best friend or a new playmate. And right then you have,
Wow.
conflict that erupts and a parent trying to navigate that. So
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating. What the other, as you were playing through the scenarios, I was also thinking about the difference between mom and dad.
mm,
I'm not going to go into gender stereotypes there, but so you've got all these players, all these members of the family with a different lens, and a different communication style. And of course, you use the barrier. We talked about language barriers earlier, but the other thing that struck me as you're talking about cultural barriers is like, well, Eastern European. So like I've been on holiday in I was in Egypt actually, learning to dive, and for some reason we got chatting. It was a long taxi trip, and I was talking to the taxi driver about hotels and different nationalities, and he said, "Oh, well, we used to put English and Russian people together in hotels, and it never worked, because you've got a difference between what UK culture and Russian culture. I mean, we don't need to talk about difference between Russian and Ukraine at the moment, given all the stuff that's going, the war, the stuff that's going on. The war? It's a war, isn't it? But I'm thinking the difference between Eastern European and West Coast Americans, and the difference between West Coast Americans and East Coast Americans, and urban Americans and rural Americans, and it's all a very big. Everybody's got 7 billion different unique lenses on the world, pairs of lenses on the world, and the Eastern Europeans are more withdrawn culturally. They're not as open. That you can't read their faces. I've seen like Bulgarians and people like that. You see them and you think, I only see them when I'm on holiday. I've not been to Bulgaria. I've not been to Russia. I've not been to Ukraine. But I'm seeing them on holiday, and they don't seem to be having a very good time.
that's so funny. Yeah, well, it's funny. There is the saying though that I don't know if you've heard this before in terms of like context, but I lived in Ukraine for so long, but people would say that Ukrainians or Eastern Europeans are like a watermelon, like very hard on the outside and very soft on the inside, whereas Americans are like a peach, very soft on the outside, but very hard on the
Oh
inside.
wow!
Yeah, and I always thought that that was such a true, right? Because like we're known for like, I mean, my friends would always say, "Why do Americans smile so much?" Or like adoptive kids would say, "Why are they always smiling?" Right? Like, why are all these people smiling? Because like you observed, right, the exterior of the Eastern European, and I think anybody that lived through the communist regime, right, it was that like you don't smile at people on the street, right? It was like everything you. I mean, it was this whole era of suspicion, right? So it was like you had the straight face in public, and I think communism has obviously, ceased in terms of ruling power for some time, but I think that just culturally passed down, right? Of this idea of like a very hard street face. And then you compare that to like the US, right? And then I loved your comparison of even, yes, like East Coast, West Coast, rural, urban, because that's so true, right? I'm from the West Coast, very different from like whenever I've been in the South of the United States. It's like, why is everybody so friendly? Why does everybody smile all the time, right? It's like there's just an affect that is, more friendly. But at the same time, like I could say that yes, whereas we're so good at giving this warm and friendly, right, exterior, sometimes we struggle in letting people like very much inside, right, into our personal depth. Whereas I look at my relationships with some of my Ukrainian friends, although it might have taken longer to get there, I look at some of those relationships are so much deeper because of how soft, right, the internalness of the Ukrainian is and how deep they want to go. So yeah, you bring that into adoption, right? And so the kid has this maybe rough exterior that is going to take longer to get to, right, to soften, and yet you have these parents who have this really soft exterior, and they're warm and fuzzy like that peach, but yet maybe they're struggling, right, to deal with some of their own internal stuff, right? I know you and I, we talked about like, how adoption brings up your own internal baggage, right? And it's like the parents that are willing to deal with that, and unlock some of that, it helps them be more successful in parenting.
Yeah. To what extent? Yeah, I was just thinking about like being. So I'm from the north of England, right? And if I go down and ride the underground, the metro in London, you smile at somebody, they think you're a nutter. That's clearly not a technical term. So how did that play out? How did that play out? How did you see that playing out within adoptive families? That peach versus watermelon approach.
Well, I think it was just the whole idea of time, time to kind of peel back some of those layers. I found that some parents wanted to stick their kids in counseling like right away, right? It was like, okay, we're home, we see this issue, like kid, in America, it's kind of like the understanding of like counseling fixes everything, right? Like quick, get the kid in counseling. But I think, like we know is that like counseling really only works if you're ready to do it. You know what I mean? Like you have to be willing to go there and to talk about things. And I think that some kids, were maybe put in counseling too soon, and they were just that watermelon, right? Of like the hard exterior of like, I'm not going to go there, right? Like, I'm not going to share anything. But as time went on, right, and like language acquisition was better, they're, maturing, just in terms of adolescence, it was like, suddenly there could be some self-awareness of like, okay, like I think I'm ready to maybe talk about some things, and I'd be willing to do that. Because I think I had something like, I can't remember the exact percentage, but the majority of people I interviewed had tried counseling, and the majority of them had said it didn't work, right? Like they put their kid in counseling and they saw no benefits. Unless I reframed that as like, did the kid want counseling? It was like, if the kid wanted counseling and was ready to go through some kind of like therapy counseling, then the results, right? Like they actually saw a change in behavior or a change in mindset because the child or teenager, often by this point, was willing to engage, right? And willing to talk about things. So yeah, so I feel like that kind of gets at some of that, is like, where are you at with your softness or your hardness of wanting to go there? And I think same, for parents too. It's like, if they were willing to kind of go to their own past and talk about some of the things that maybe had affected, their parenting, or even their desire to adopt, right? Because I think some people adopt with like a savior complex, right? And they think that they can, by fixing somebody else, right, they're going to fix themselves, or there is this idea of, yeah, and if they're not seen as the savior, right, if the child doesn't look to them with immense gratitude, there is kind of some brokenness that they have to deal with. And I think, nobody wants to admit having a savior complex, right? It's like they would never maybe say, oh, I'm going to adopt, right? But I mean, I even remember that coming up in interviews of families saying it was like, we were going to save a child, right? Save a child from institutional life. But a child doesn't necessarily see themselves as in need of saving, right? It was like they were living the only life they knew, and then a parent came in, and was, bringing them out for that. And so gratitude sometimes came in at some point, but that usually wasn't like the leading, attitude. And I think so parents maybe struggled with that as well.
Yeah, this is a fascinating area for me, because some people that adoptive parents, or like um when I'm having a conversation with somebody, they it's been very rare, okay, because people will check me out and they know that I'm not going to hijack them, but I have been hijacked. I've been hijacked, but I've never I've never gone on a podcast and hijacked an adoptive parent, and said to them, or gone anywhere near this savior complex or gratitude. But there's a lot of adoptees who are very upset about being told that they should be grateful, but I've never been told that. I literally have never been told that, and they really they get angry about being called angry. They get angry about being called ungrateful, and their whole locus of control is on, well, what other people say to them. And I find it, yeah, I find it completely incomprehensible. Personally, I've never been anywhere near that. And people talk to me about savior complex and stuff like that. I said, well, I don't know. I've not had any lived experience. I mean, it's. Have you heard adoptive parents having a realization that that's where they were coming from, and
Oh,
then
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that it was that whole idea of, well, and I think it was that understanding, like, and part of that too is like they were painted the picture, or they heard the a lot of families were moved to adopt specifically from Ukraine because they heard about what happens to kids when they age out of the system, right? So I mean, like, the percentage of girls that could be human trafficked, boys that end up right in prison because of crime. And so it's right, this humanitarian justice is what motivates them to say, our family is going to, right, make a difference for one, right? We're going to save one child from that outcome, right? Because like the outcome is presented as very negative. So I understand why a family, like maybe without intending to, comes with that, like, of course we're saving a child from prostitution, from whatever. And so they come in with like, ooh, swooping in, getting this child or children out of that situation. Whereas that child, like, they're not aware of these statistics. They're not aware of like
they don't
any of these
see.
things.
Yeah, they
Yeah, they don't.
haven't. They haven't. That hasn't happened to them yet.
Yeah. So what did they need saving from? Right. And it's like, and they've seen as like, okay, maybe America has been idealized, right? I always say that kids like come to America expecting Disneyland, right? They've seen the American films. They think like, oh, well, you're just offering me a better life, right? And so I'd like a better life than I have right now. And for many of the kids too, this idea of mom and dad, right, has been idealized in their mind of like they were very hurt because most of these children, right, came from like situations of alcohol abuse, neglect, right? So their often understanding of mom and dad has been very negative. And so now they, have family coming in. So you have child with idealized view of what mom and dad are going to be. And you have parents with this, we're saving you from a really bad outcome. And then that comes together and you have child who doesn't express gratitude or like realize, right, maybe perhaps what could have happened to them. And then you have child who these aren't the Disney parents that they expected, right? And so you have this like clash of expectations often, right from the very beginning. And I think that, but you asked the question about did parents have that realization? And I think very much so, right? Is that as they realize like, yes, perhaps we did prevent some kind of outcome here. But the reality, and parents who saw kids dealing with really hard things, it's like, we haven't really prevented, like, we are now parents, but it's like, this child can make really poor decisions here, right? Like, they could still be, right, end up pregnant and on the street in America by, decisions that they make. So it's like us adopting them doesn't prevent negative outcome, but it does create a safety net, right? They now have two loving adults that are caring about their future and what happens to them. But we can't prevent that, right? Like this child has to make their own decisions and we're going to, love them and support them and try our best to like put the safety nets around them. But I think that was kind of the realization that parents had is like, we can't prevent harm, you know, big harm to our child, right? It's like we do the best we can, um and trust God with the outcome. So I think that was a realization of like, wow, we weren't coming to save, like we were coming to come around and to support, and to help this child as best we can, but we are not his or her savior. And so I definitely saw that realization with a lot of families.
Yeah. I'm so glad you used those words at the end of that section, that end of the answer, because I was like thinking, well, if I was in that position and I thought, well, I didn't think I was coming as a savior, and now I've realized I'm coming from a savior. What am I going to do now? What's after that? And what's the alternative? And for a guy who you probably noticed can go on a bit, I can talk, right? I've asked some very long-winded questions. I think I'm slightly out of my comfort zone with some of this stuff today. So anyway, that's maybe why I'm not being, and it is between Christmas and New Year, so I'm making all sorts of excuses. But anyway, so if you use the word safety net and you use the word support, I was thinking, okay, if I'm an adoptive parent, I've realized now that I don't need to save my kid. I need to support my kid. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, okay, now I can go forward from I can go forward. I'm on safe ground now. I'm safe ground. I know I know where I'm coming from now. Do you know what I mean? Like, because if I think I'm going to save them, and that I'm told I can't, that's wrong. I'm wrong to have thought I could save. Then it's almost as if the rug's been whipped from underneath my feet, and I don't know what I need to do now.
Well, it takes a lot of pressure off you. It takes a lot of pressure off you as well if you realize like it's not your job to save. I mean, that's a lot of pressure to live with, right? It's like every decision your child makes, right? It's like it kind of is reflective of you, right? If you come in with that savior complex. But if like what you're saying, if it's the if it's the support and the safety net, right? It's like it's a two-way thing. It's like you're here to offer the child and to get them the help and the support that they need to function, right, as a healthy adult. Then it becomes more about like coaching, partnering, all of those things. Um, right. Because especially with older children, you're not nurturing them, right? It's different than an infant adoption where you're like deciding what they eat and don't eat and what they touch and don't touch, right? Whereas like when you're adopting an older child, right, you are coming in much more, I think, as this guide and coach, right, to give them that safety of like, this is what family can be, right? You didn't have this in Ukraine, and we're trying to show you what family can be. But that takes time, right? I remember several kids saying, right, it took them time to understand what a family was, right? They'd never lived from what they could remember in a family. And so like that doesn't happen. You don't learn what family is overnight, and I remember several families said it took 2 years to finally feel. They said it was like a year you were kind of like, okay, finding a bit of a groove, but most adoptive families who adopted older children said it took about 2 years to feel like a family and to navigate that well.
Yeah. Wow, big stuff here. So I mean, if breaking it down, it's another, you've got a language barrier, you've got a cultural barrier, you've got a kind of a barrier in terms of the expectations that different members of the family have, and you've also got this barrier in terms of, well, I guess how do you express that? It's a transition from institutional life to family life,
Mm-hmm.
and institution a transition from an orphanage to a home.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot there. There's definitely a lot there. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about in terms of we started off quite narrow with this integration of biological and adoptee children. Then we went into more of the cultural stuff, the language stuff, the emotional stuff, the self-awareness stuff, the expectation stuff. Is there anything else that comes to mind in terms of the integration piece that I've not asked you about?
Well, I think it's, if anything, I mean, maybe I hinted at this, but just again, the giving things time, and I think that, families will look back, and when you're in the midst of like crisis or something that's really hard, right? When the newness of transitioning, your family is just happening, right? You're like in the throes of it. But then I remember, families saying, but then, 4 years went by and it was like we were able to look back. And it was like the first year, it was like the clear distinction of like who we were before the adoption, who we were after the adoption. And I think it's just that beautiful gift of how time changes things, of um and that's really true in all our relationships, right? Of how we look back like on the newness of a friendship or a marriage or any of those things. It's like who you are at the beginning is very different than who you are, a year in, 2 years in, 5 years in. And I think it's the same with an adoption. And so the challenges that you have today are going to be different than the challenges you have tomorrow, but then you're going to look back and see how far you've come. And especially, it's interesting because some of the families that I interviewed had now adult adopted children, and there were some that had kind of distanced themselves from the family, kind of done as they had grown, and maybe they came home for the holidays, but they had, they weren't the kid to have the close relationship, like call mom, weekly, like maybe the biological child calls mom weekly to check in. And the other child didn't. But then there was the opposite, where there was some adoptive children that had like a very strong, attachment to family, and were at every family gathering and, on the phone with mom, regularly to check in. So, Yeah, each family story is so unique. And I mean, I know that you probably recognize from different people that you've talked to is like the amount of trauma that a child has experienced in their past, right, is directly going to often affect the level of attachment they're going to have with their biological family. And I would say I saw that, firsthand, is of varying degrees of adult attachment, as the child grew up. So
Um, I definitely, yeah. The layers. My metaphor for it is is a cake of complexity. So you've got people, talk about this primal wound. You've got obviously a transracial thing plays into that, adds a layer. There's the transnational side. There's also obviously the trauma that's happened pre-adoption. So all these things add up to a many-layered cake. And I'm not going to ask you what the difference is that makes the difference. No, I am actually. Would you take a run at it in terms of the difference that makes the difference, in your opinion?
in a more attached relationship specifically.
In a better outcome for the adoptee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
And I
found.
promised you no soundbite questions before we started recording. So if you'd rather not.
Oh yeah, no. This is a great question, because one thing I think I kind of hinted at before about how saying that, the personality types, right, like the more compassionate people in general were led, right, to adopt. But what was so fascinating, especially, because as I interviewed families, I was in their home, right, so I would stay with these families. It was a very up and close personal interview, because I'd often stay with the family for 1 or 2 days, sleeping in their home, and then interview. So you're also observing the family, right? And I would say in general that families, and I would often say a combination of mom and dad, but like that were very type A personality, right? Like ordered. They're the family that you just kind of picture as like structure, order, very put together, type A, right? That their handling, right, of expectations was a lot more challenging, right, because it's like they had the way that they thought things should go. They're willing to do work, right, they're willing to work on themselves, work on the relationship, but it's just like they have the structure that they want things to fit into, and it's very hard for them, like when it's not going well, right? Whereas like there was the families that I would call more the chaos families, right? Not type A, like more of like anything goes, a little crazier at home, often more kids. Um, they seem to just like roll with it a little bit better. Like their family style was roll with it, and like we'll deal with it, as we need to. And they were much more like, they seem to have a closer connection sometimes with their adoptive child. And I don't know if that, so I mean, I don't know the underpinnings of it all. Like I'm not a psychologist of like, I'm sure you could really get into like why those families were not connecting as much as why these ones were, but it was like something about more chaotic people, right, that just had so much going on, less structure to their lives, seemed to have like a deeper level of empathy and connection with their adopted children than those that were the highly structured type A personalities. And obviously I'm making a very wide generalization, but that was just something that I found, I discovered, as I interviewed different families.
Yeah. I wrote down one word before you answered the question in terms of, how I would say it. And it's slightly different to
Uh-huh.
my other answer. But I think it kind of feeds into yours. So the word I wrote down was curiosity.
Oh, I love
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So, and I think it's the opposite of fixed outcomes, isn't it?
Mhm.
The type A personality want it, it's my way or the highway. It's the fixed outcome. It's the goal. This is where we're going to get to. Here are the steps we're going to go. We're moving on. We're keeping going. We're the leader, and it's very command and control. Whereas curiosity is open, is openness. Like laissez-faire may seem to be a bit, well, no, you can't. Well, when do I not laissez-faire? When do I? So from what that was my take on the one take on the difference that makes the difference. I would say more fundamentally, my opinion from what I've heard from other adoptive parents and my impression who know other adoptive parents, I would say the number one thing is the self-awareness of the adoptive parent. Mm-hmm. And that's the number one thing. I also say the self-awareness of the adoptee who runs the Thriving Adoptees podcast, i.e. me. The most important thing for any human being is their self-awareness. It's my relationships start with me.
And I think what you said with curiosity goes hand in hand with that, because I think more curious people are more self-aware because they're interested in asking the questions, right? Like, why this, why that, right? So I mean, I definitely think curiosity and self-awareness go hand in hand. And I would definitely say, bringing that back to the adoptive parent, it's like, yeah, because they want to understand their child, right? They want to understand themselves and they want to understand their child. And that's just going to lead them that much more on the journey, right, of connecting with their kids, is because they're learning more about themselves and they're learning more about their kids, right? They're not just getting stuck in those rigid things of this is the way it is, right? And so I think that understanding of curiosity and self-awareness go hand in hand for sure.
And so flipping that round in terms of the something that you said about putting the kids in counseling, is no, we do the counseling ourselves first. We do that, we do our own work, and this also is in the adoptee community, right? So there are adoptees out there who are adoptee influencers who I have spoken to who haven't done their own work, and they're still bleeding from their primal wound. And you've got to do your own work first. It's just there's no shortcut to it. So you can't do it. And the people that are listening, right? I say this every now and again, but I'm going to drop it in case people listening haven't heard it, right? Because they're going to say, well, how do I do that? And I say to them, you're already doing it, listeners, because you've been listening to Karen and me talk for the last hour or so. So you're already doing your work. You're already being curious. Just keep on doing it. If you can turn up your dial and your curiosity, if you can find some new podcasts, find some new audios, find some new videos, keep on, stay curious and keep doing it, and keep dialing, keep on keeping on, and that's and we'll get better each day. It's whatever, micro steps, isn't it? It's huge steps and lots of micro steps.
Yeah, that's a good reminder.
Sorry, listeners, I've had 2 pints of water today, and that clearly hasn't been enough. Karen, as usual, as I said at the top, listeners, check out the show notes for a link to Karen's book and her website. And we will speak to you again very soon. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Karen. It's been a delight.
Thank you.